Of our Living Extinction series. Nice to see you here on this wet evening. I hope everyone's voted appropriately. If you haven't, leave now. And good luck and solidarity tomorrow. I just took a box of chocks actually back down to the polling station in Brockley. Some of them are really wet and miserable, so I kind of appreciated a little bit of, a little bit of a lift. They were actually requesting hot things, but chocolate would do. Anyway, welcome to this evening's event. I know people that have been in my classes know that I do tend to end on kind of like low notes and then think, oh no, try and raise the tone. It's always really hard, and it's particularly difficult here. But just intellectually, I'm really interested and anticipatory of the paper this evening. I kind of feel like, flagging a few kind of recent kind of moments. Just got back from Finland, where I wasn't with her, but one of our former PhD students, Taru Elving, is now a historian and curator based in Turku. She was off in some of the northern territories in Finland, observing what, from my perspective in Turku, looked like the cleanest snow I'd ever seen. From her perspective, it was a vanishing landscape of receding ice and snow, and the ever more becoming available of the land to a mining boom. So kind of questions of continued displaced communities, destruction of wildlife, environmental pollution, and nothing slowing down, in fact escalating. And of course some of us, especially those of us with friends in Australia, where some of the world's wealthiest cities like Sydney are currently surrounded by fires, and birds and bats are falling out of the sky dead. I won't go on with the kind of apocalyptic list, because I can also do kind of science fiction apocalypse tones as well, which starts to kind of strike the wrong affect. But we know that we're here with a series that's speaking to the conditions that we're facing, and that those conditions are extremely trying. It's going to be, I hope, a different kind of experience this evening when we go to possibly the more philosophical of the series of 8. And Wood's going to introduce Wahida's specialisms, her books, and the theme of tonight's lecture.
Just felt like I also had to speak, because we've done this series together, and it's been a really fun experience, and I hope that those of you that have come to all of the talks know that we're going to kind of try and pursue some other kind of output, as obviously the issues we're discussing are by no means closed or resolved. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Wahida Khandker tonight, selfishly due to my own interests in ecological poesis. Wahida is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her research focuses on intersections between process thought, particularly the work of Henri Bergson, which I'm also excited about, and biology. She's the author of Philosophy, Animality, and the Life Sciences from Edinburgh University Press in 2014, and Process Metaphysics and Mutative Life, Sketches of Lived Time from Palgrave Macmillan forthcoming, from which I think we're hearing a version of one of the chapters tonight. And she's also the co-editor of a new book series called Palgrave Perspectives in Process Philosophy. So please join me in welcoming Wahida Khandker.
Hello everyone, thank you Lynn and Wood for inviting me today, even on election day. So I hope as Lynn said, everyone's voted. Can everyone hear me? Is that, great, I can. So what I'm going to do is just read through this slightly shortened version of a chapter from the book, and I'm hoping as I go, it'll be as I go through the introduction, it'll be self-explanatory, and deliberately focusing on this particular bird. So if I start reading, and I'll explain the structure of the paper as I go. So the noisy miner, which is this bird here, is a despot. That's to say, this common native of the eastern and southeastern regions of Australia, including Tasmania, an avian honey-eater, has acquired the status of a despotic species due to its particularly aggressive defence of its territory and the resulting impact on smaller competing birds. Now, the noisy miner's despotic status is perhaps most identified with its tendency to form mobs of around 20 or more individuals who chase away both potential predators and perceived conspecific competitors, so other species of birds, and that's for territory or resources. And it dominates territory to such an extent that despite being a protected species under Australian law, some control, that is culling, of the species has actually been discussed as a potential means to provide some of the declining smaller bird species a chance to flourish. Now, a brief survey of the ethological and ecological literature on this bird reveals a gradual shift in its status that we might characterise as a derogation of the species. So an early description of the noisy miner by John Gould in his 1865 Handbook to the Birds of Australia then identified it as the garrulous honey-eater and points merely to an irritating presence on walks through the Australian forest. He says, in disposition it is restless, inquisitive, bold and noisy, and frequently performs the most grotesque actions, spreading out the wings and tail, hanging from the branches in every possible variety of position, and keeping up all the time an incessant babbling. Were this only momentary or for a short time, their droll attitudes and singular note would be rather amusing than otherwise. But when they follow you through the entire forest, leaping and flying from branch to branch, they become very troublesome and annoying. Now we see a century later accounts that range from relatively benign descriptions of a successful, dominant urban adapter to decidedly less favourable portrayals of a hyper-aggressive bird, a reverse keystone species, a despot, and a potentially invasive species if it should succeed in migrating beyond its indigenous territories. There was even one report, which didn't get a look in this chapter, that referred to them as terrorists. So didn't include it for obvious reasons. So basically the structure of the paper, the rest of this paper, is to really survey and to look at different approaches to speciation, how we think about successful species and also those that are too successful at the one end, and then those at risk of extinction on the other. So in the first part of the paper I'm going to talk about Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, then Charles Darwin as an overview of key points from the origin of species, and then compare that or contrast that with a survey of some contemporary approaches to biodiversity. So just to really think through the changes over the last 150 years or so, almost 200 years actually, in our attitudes towards or our understanding of biodiversity, and I hope it will raise lots of questions and problems, because I'm not putting forward let's say a strong particular position. I have my own views on this, and I hope we can discuss it later on in the at the end of the paper. Okay, so beneath the ecological study of the place of any particular species within an ecosystem operates a range of assumptions about the modes of interaction of individuals, populations, environments, and the processes of adaptation at a genetic level. Now in this paper I want to consider the shifts in species status from success to threat in terms of the development of a hierarchy of species roles, commencing with Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, the relationship between the two key macroscopic processes of heritable variation and environmental change, and later developments in the study of the relationship between these macroscopic and also microscopic processes. I'll consider the latter relation with reference to the interventions made by theorists in biology and physics interested in the possibilities of a quantum biology, or at the very least some potential applications of quantum dynamic models to our understanding of biological processes, including the ecological concern with the dynamics of populations. It shouldn't get too technical. I'm a philosopher, not a physicist, so it'll be my understanding of these problems. Now, although we see Darwin attempt to demonstrate the self-shaping dynamic of evolution, later iterations of this in contemporary conservation biology, as exemplified in the case of the despotic noisy miner, assume for themselves the directing hand of artificial selection, so manifested, for example, in ecosystem management, in order to determine the fates of different species. Now, Darwin himself only tentatively rejects any idea of final causes or purposes from evolution, but the debate recurs in modern biology about the drivers and direction of evolution. Contemporary approaches to ecosystem management continue to make, arguably, teleological assumptions about the roles of different species, and equally debatable judgments about what constitutes a self-contained or containable ecosystem. By increments, then, we start to venture into discourses on the purposes of conservation, its practices of things like annexing land and culling populous species. Okay, so Charles Darwin, it's worth remembering, was quite aware of how distinctive and potentially unpalatable his ideas were, comparing the early controversy provoked by Charles Lyell's theory of gradual geological change to his own idea of natural selection, in the hope that it might eventually come to be widely accepted. This is Darwin. He says, as modern geology has almost banished such views as the excavation of a great valley by a single diluvial wave, so will natural selection, if it be a true principle, banish the belief of the continued creation of new organic beings, or of any great and sudden modification in their structure. Now, thinking beyond the personal dynamics between Darwin and Lyell, so Lyell was in many ways friend, mentor, an important discussion of the nature of species distinctions arises in the transition from Lyell's work, The Principles of Geology, from around 1835, and Darwin's Origin of Species, obviously published in 1859. So for the purposes of this paper, I want to focus on two key aspects of the Principles of Geology. First, the way in which Lyell situates his own work against the grain of an ancient heritage of cosmogonical explanation. So talking about the birth of the universe. Second, his denial of transmutation from one species into another. Now, this will serve both, or rather as an introduction to Darwin's main thesis of evolution by natural selection and its implications for our understanding of the nature of species distinctions. Now, it's also meant to be a discussion of the process implications of this, so I've actually edited out some of that. But again, if anybody's particularly interested in that, I'm happy to answer some questions. Anyway, so this paper will focus on, as I said, the nature of species distinctions and the distinctions between natural and unnatural, or indigenous and invasive, which are themselves dynamic categories or mobile boundaries at work in the intertwined histories of philosophy and the sciences. Now, Charles Lyell's lengthy historical survey of the roots of geology reveals what he surmises to be an erroneous yet continuing assumption that there was some distinction between ancient causes of geological change and contemporary processes. He says, in other words, they supposed that the causes by which the crust of the Earth and its habitable surface have been modified at remote periods were almost entirely distinct from the operations by which the surface and crust of the planet are now undergoing a gradual change. So commencing with a range of ancient cosmogonies spanning Eastern and Western thought, including Egyptian ideas and their continuation into ancient Greek philosophy, so Plato, Aristotle, Stoicism, and medieval thought, Lyell points to the predominance of a catastrophist view of the creation of the world, typically either by ekpyrosis, excuse my Greek, or conflagration, or cataclysm, so diluvial theories. The story that Lyell constructs from his long sketch is of the gradual emergence of insights into a quite different picture of geological change. Ancient causes of geological change are, it's revealed, ongoing. This is Lyell's uniformitarianism. Now, the specific configuration of Lyell's theory, in which geological processes are uniform and cyclical, has particular consequences for how we think about the age of the Earth, the possibility of the transmutation of species, if considered in relation to the speed and nature of geological change, and the effects of human activity on geology. Now, the challenge to the ancient cosmogonical theories is most notably, of course, a challenge to creationist underestimations of the age of the Earth. Now, for Lyell, ancient thinkers were clearly venturing into the territory of what would become modern science. But the ancient history of the globe, he says, was to them a sealed book. And although written in characters of the most striking and imposing kind, they were unconscious even of its existence. Now, Lyell's diagnosis of the ills of the ensuing period of history in the West that frustrated the significant development of geological research centred on the problem of the interpretation of fossil remains and the possibility of framing any interpretation in terms of the story of Noah and the flood, for example. Now, the discovery and analysis of the fossil record, piecemeal over time, and the insights of a few notable theorists who rejected the idea that fossils were simply spontaneously occurring mineral formations. There were theories that said that. Identifying them instead as the mineralized imprints of once living organisms. And that brings with it the intertwining of processes of geological and organic change. Now, Lyell, who's seemingly setting the scene for Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, at first rejects as fantastical the idea of the transmutation of species from simple to complex, if the latter, more complex, means more perfect, and if the efficient cause of change is environmental influence combined with use and disuse, say in the Lamarckian sense. Displacement, he says, not transmutation, is the primary effector of changes in population of species in any given habitat. Now, Lyell's rationale for opting for the former explanation appeals to evidence of the suitability of different species for particular environments, such that, he says, even if we thought it possible that the palm or the elephant, which now flourish in equatorial regions, could ever learn to bear the variable seasons of our temperate zone or the rigours of an Arctic winter, we should, with no less confidence, affirm that they must perish before they had time to become habituated to such new circumstances. Now, at stake is a relationship between two processes. So first, the rooting and reproduction of species in climates favourable to their characteristics. And second, the altering pace of geological change. Now, if one were to speculate on how the gradual transmutations might occur, we could, in the manner of a reductio ad absurdum, demonstrate just how improbable this process must be. I'm speaking in Lyell's terms. He says we pass at once to the last grand step in the progressive scheme, whereby orangutan, having been already evolved out of a monad, is made slowly to attain the attributes and dignity of man. Now, in order to dismiss this thought further, Lyell cites the ancient idea of the gradual degeneration of creation from an original perfect state. The gradual process of improvement and complication from simple to complex beings, he thinks, is simply a reversal of this now redundant ancient idea. So faced with a paucity of evidence, Lyell is demonstrating that the only inductively responsible way to develop causal hypotheses about the prehistoric past is to find real causes. And this is what one commentator says. Observed repeatedly that are competent under different modifications to the production of a great multitude of effects, at least analogous to those effects constituted by the data of paleontology and natural history. So whilst evidence of geological influence on organisms is clear, and an influence that's often fatal, such as earthquakes volcanic eruptions and tsunamis, and so they demonstrate this clearly to us. The inverse organic influence on geology is minimal. So taking the example of the effects of the success in the evolutionary sense of the human species, the extent of human influence is limited to the introduction or replacement of other species, such as the dispersion of plants beyond their original borders, or the introduction of Rattus rattus, the European rat, and consequent effects on indigenous species to the New World. So this is Lyell. It says, we may regard the involuntary agency of man as strictly analogous to that of inferior animals. Like them, we unconsciously contribute to extend or limit the geographical range and numbers of certain species in obedience to general rules in the economy of nature, which are for the most part beyond our control. So it's not, Lyell argues, an exclusive prerogative of human beings to conquer land and to defend that land forcibly, since every other species possesses this impetus, resulting in comparable observable phenomena of the domination or even the extirpation of some species by others. Furthermore, not only is human influence simply exploiting a niche or role that would otherwise be occupied by a range of other species, but geological processes have proven to be operating on such a vast timescale that the relatively recent appearance of Homo sapiens cannot yet be cited as a significant agent of change. This is Lyell again. He says, if all the nations of the earth should attempt to quarry away the lava which flowed during one eruption from the Icelandic volcanoes in 1783 and the 2 following years, and should attempt to consign it to the deepest abysses of the ocean, wherein it might approach most nearly to the profundities from which it rose in the volcanic vent, they might toil for thousands of years before their task was accomplished. Yet the matter borne down by the Ganges and Burramputta in a single year probably exceeds in weight and volume the mass of Icelandic lava produced by that great eruption. So Lyell's early reflections on the variety and distribution of species firmly rejects any idea of transmutation in favour of the appearance of diverse forms and the effects of migration and encroachment of different species upon one another. So the dynamic proper to life demands that species must succeed or be supplanted by stronger populations or risk extinction, itself a natural consequence of this fundamental process of life. So Lyell will, of course, concede to Darwin's revision of the hypothesis of transmutation, and I'll turn to this next. Okay, so recall, if you can, the 2 levels of process I'm trying to think through here. First, the rooting and reproduction of species in climates favourable to their characteristics, and second, the altering pace of geological change. Now, Darwin will incorporate a third, and that's the internal and heritable process of adaptation. Now, with Darwin, we find that mutability by insensible degrees, rather than sudden acts of creation, is the primary fact of living organisms and of their encompassing living systems. We're dealing less with the origin of species, so some ideal form or repository of potentiality, than with the transition from incipient to established identifiable species that, quoting, in order to become in any degree permanent, necessarily have to struggle with the other inhabitants of the country. So the changing conditions of life, environmental factors, and the mutability of organic bodies favours those individuals that can make the best use of available resources. So this is the essential dynamic of natural selection. And furthermore, mutability is not just improvement, it waxes and wanes with changes in the environment. Now, there are, of course, important caveats to this, illustrated in Darwin's incorporation of certain cultural prejudices against apparently less developed and less well-evolved populations of both humans and non-humans in the southern hemisphere, such as those inhabiting Australasia. At this point, it's important to acknowledge the extent to which the theory of natural selection is flexible enough to allow for a non-hierarchical view of species, why we continue to read it. Darwin is primarily interested in a phenomenon that's in fact quite ubiquitous. And he says, how have all those exquisite adaptations of one part of the organisation to another part, and to the conditions of life, and of one distinct organic being to another being, been perfected? We see these beautiful co-adaptations most plainly in the woodpecker and mistletoe, and only a little less plainly in the humblest parasite, which clings to the hairs of a quadruped or feathers of a bird, in the structure of the beetle which dives through the water, in the plumed seed which is wafted by the gentlest breeze. In short, we see beautiful adaptations everywhere and in every part of the organic world. That's Darwin. Now, in his discussion of the law of acclimatization, we see a subordination of any idea of perfectibility to one of adaptation. So species are not simply improving in accordance with some ideal measure of perfection or power. Rather, they demonstrate the capacity to become acclimatized to certain conditions. Now, for Darwin, this presents us with the difficult task of identifying the precise roles of habit, use, and disuse, and the role of innate differences in shaping evolution. So once a species becomes acclimatized or habituated to a certain environment, it attains a certain vulnerability through its gradually developed inflexibility. So well adapted, it's inflexible. Now recall that Lyell saw the habituation of species to particular environments, so his example of elephants in equatorial regions, as proof against the possibility of adaptation, whilst here Darwin merely seeks to account for the tendency that demonstrates that evolution does not necessarily advance towards greater perfection. So with Darwin, it's the continuing development and selection of innate differences that seems to have priority. Now, speaking again to a resistance to hierarchical thinking, Darwin identifies a further law in which distinct species present analogous variations. This is me quoting again. And a variety of one species often assumes some of the characters of an allied species, or it reverts to some of the characters of an early progenitor. So the phenomenon of what we now call convergent evolution illustrates the emergence of similar characteristics in otherwise unrelated species, or the reversion to characteristics thought lost once belonging to earlier generations of the same species. Characteristics can recur and will, if proving advantageous, or at the very least not harmful or prohibitive in any way, persist in succeeding generations. So a recurrence of characteristics, whether this is across distinct species or along intergenerational lines, demonstrates the importance of efficiency and a certain frugality in natural processes. Now, this is a point of contention in a number of Darwin's respondents. So the complex and yet efficient process of natural selection is nowhere better for Darwin, illustrated than in the cell-making instinct of the hive bee. And Darwin marvels at observations amongst mathematicians, quoting, that bees have practically solved a recondite problem and have made their cells of the proper shape to hold the greatest possible amount of honey with the least possible consumption of precious wax in their construction. And finally, the complex web of beautiful adaptations is underpinned by the relentless struggle for existence waged between individuals and species, both with one another and in the face of ever-changing environmental conditions. And this, quoting this sort of famous passage, it's the doctrine of Malthus, applied with manifold force to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms. For in this case, there can be no artificial increase in food and no prudential restraint in marriage, although some species may be now increasing more or less rapidly in numbers. All cannot do so, for the world would not hold them. Now this returns us to the fate of weaker in inverted commas, individuals and species. Using the example of a relationship between certain ants and aphids, Darwin observes that each species tries to take advantage of the weaker bodily structures of others. Weakness, and thus disadvantage, manifests in varying forms at varying levels, as we saw in the case of habituation or acclimatization that gives rise to vulnerability, such as an unsuitability for either warmer or colder climates. Now, the process of refinement or specialisation can cause a characteristic to tip over from an advantageous skill to a fatal disadvantage. Now, commenting on his own experiments on caterpillars and the successive stages of their hammock weaving, Darwin observes that if he interrupts what he identifies as 6 distinct stages of construction, the caterpillar is constrained in its possible responses. In one experiment, he notes how a caterpillar at the 3rd stage of hammock building was put into one in the 6th stage of construction. And this is Darwin saying, so that much of its work was already done for it. But far from feeling the benefit of this, it was much embarrassed, and in order to complete its hammock, seemed forced to start from the 3rd stage where it had left off, and thus try to complete the already finished work. Now, the instinctive action described here is an innate skill that aids the subsistence of the caterpillar in its environment. But when it's subjected to an impediment, albeit a somewhat mischievous human one, the impetus to work in specified stages could delay the caterpillar in its construction of its protective home, and thereby leave it vulnerable to predation, or simply to the elements. So the emergence of disadvantage from what was previously a strength is also demonstrable for Darwin in a general priority of new species over older ones, since the action over time of competition for resources produces better adaptations or stronger characteristics. As Darwin notes, referring to evidence from the fossil record, rarity is the precursor to extinction. The rarer a species, the more vulnerable it is to extinction, which is simply the final component of the process of natural selection. And he notes, as an example, the marsupials of Australasia, dwellers of the southern hemisphere, and who are comparatively weak when set alongside more recently evolved placental mammals of Europe. And he says it may be doubted, for instance, whether the Australian marsupials, which are divided into groups differing but little from each other, and feebly representing, as Mr. Waterhouse and others have remarked, are carnivorous, ruminant and rodent mammals, could successfully compete with these well-pronounced orders. In the Australian mammals, we see the process of diversification in an early and incomplete stage of development. So if Australian mammals and European mammals were in a fight, who would win? So the path to extinction is then simply a path towards newer and better adapted species. However, this does raise particular difficulty for Darwin, spawning his discussions of the geological record in the latter chapters of The Origin of Species. So if extinct species are the intermediate steps between extant species, then why is the fossil record not replete with examples of these intermediate species? And Darwin's response is simply that the geological record is incomplete. It is, he says, a history of the world imperfectly kept and written in a changing dialect. Of this history, we possess the last volume alone, relating only to 2 or 3 countries. Okay, I'm going to start moving on to some of the more contemporary approaches, but just a last word, I think, for Darwin. Now, the struggle for existence, the name given to the selective mechanism, dominates more contemporary ecological debates about the place and status of species within their respective ecosystems. Now, Darwin paints a picture of this often obscured war of all against all in nature. He says, we behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We often see superabundance of food. We do not see, or we forget, that the birds which are idly singing round us mostly live on insects or seeds and are thus constantly destroying life. Or we forget how largely these songsters or their eggs or their nestlings are destroyed by birds and beasts of prey. We do not always bear in mind that though food may be now superabundant, it's not so at all seasons of each recurring year. So the very definition of natural selection rests upon the assumption of limited resources, and those species that lose in the competition for resources will become rarer and eventually, in some cases, inevitably extinct. So how does the impetus to manage ecosystems emerge from this discussion? So we move from a descriptive view of natural selection to a technological or an instrumental view of it. So the practice of artificial selection, which Darwin employs to illustrate his theory. So artificial selection is augmented and carried over into the management of ecosystems based on the definition of the Earth as a limited resource. Over time, if left unchecked, the most successful species may in fact exceed the available resources. These are becoming more familiar discourses. This has led to concepts of environmental and wildlife management, annexing of national parks, and wildlife control measures, such as culling for species in excess and captive breeding for endangered species. Now, one theorist, Rosie Ibbotson, notes that historically the practice of sampling species, which is killing a specimen for preservation in a museum in order to study it. For example, many now extinct or endangered birds in New Zealand, these are particular cases she's talking about, this practice was viewed simply through the lens of natural extinction, whereas there was no acknowledgement of the role played by human beings in the loss of biodiversity. They were already on their way there, so it doesn't matter if we pick off a few more. Now, the latter view, acknowledging anthropogenic causes, a consequence of later iterations of the concept of biological extinction, is understood in terms of a new impetus to preserve biodiversity through the management of ecosystems. So what counts as a successful species is now highly contingent upon the frame of reference for studying such ecosystems. Before even embarking on a discussion of the path of any particular species towards the status of despot or invasive, a wide range of assumptions about the behaviour of ecosystems merits interrogation as a way of understanding how a species like the noisy myna might be considered an interactor at one time and an invader at another. Now, the uncertainty of species categorizations summarised by Hayet and others, and the biases of the observer insofar as they have an impact on the ways in which particular entities are treated as varieties, incipient species, or definable species, recalls the central insight of quantum mechanics into the behaviour of particles and the effects of the observer on the phenomena observed. Now, Niels Bohr, in his 1933 speculations on the relationship between the concepts of light and life, pointed to a number of potential routes for aligning the physical and the biological sciences through the properties of light. At the physical level, from the perspective of his own science, Bohr notes that the study of light reveals two complementary aspects, and this is quoting, the spatial continuity of light propagation and the atomicity of the light effects that must be treated as incompatible if solely viewed from the perspective of classical physics. Similarly, the processes of organic life express characteristics that are not immediately reducible to physical laws. Now, this irreducibility, if acknowledged in the domain of biology, as it is in the domain of quantum physics, should afford us the ability to recognise the limitations of the application of concepts and frames of reference when dealing with the dynamics of living systems. Now, in view of this stance, we might problematise the distinction between natural and artificial selection when we consider the nature and roles of human intervention in ecological functioning. So the effects of human activities such as travel and agriculture, described alongside other dynamics of other species, and the imperative to rectify or rebalance ecosystems. If human activity is not simply, as Lyell would have it, one species amongst many, exercising a natural prerogative to secure and defend resources, but rather carries with it an additional imperative, for example, to act as steward of nature, then we've already made an enormous leap outside of the realm of scientific analysis into what we might call ethics. However, before we can even address an ethical stance, a number of other assumptions and adopted frames of reference come into play in understanding the behaviour of ecosystems. So the roles of individual species within them, and the effects of human observation and intervention, which are at times the same thing. Now, in thinking about the nature of ecological analysis, we might follow Bohr's speculative stance on thinking about organic phenomena through a consideration of different levels of analysis and the interplay between them. Now, one theorist, an ecologist, Levin, sheds light upon the vast range of perspectives adopted for the purposes of understanding different aspects of an ecosystem, so spatial, temporal, organisational, and begins to echo both Bohr and also a Whiteheadian account of the world as a system of interlacing prehensions, when he points out that every organism is an observer of the environment, and life history adaptations, such as dispersal and dormancy, alter the perceptual scales of the species and the observed variability. Now, citing Bohr, the physicist Walter Sasser underlines how the microscopic variables that affect the behaviour of an organism at a macroscopic level elude observation. He says Bohr expresses this by saying that if we would try to measure with appropriate precision all those internal variables whose knowledge is required for a unique prediction of its future behaviour, for instance, by using simultaneously a sufficiently large number of Heisenberg microscopes, then the structure of the organic tissue would be disturbed to such a degree that it would no longer be capable of carrying out its vital functions. In other words, the animal would die. According to Bohr, this behaviour is essential to the operation of all organised matter. He designates it as a generalised complementarity. Operation of the vital functions precludes knowledge of the microscopic variables. Determination of the microscopic variables precludes biological operation of the living organism. Now, Alsasser makes two observations in response. First, the incommensurable relation between the microscopic and the macroscopic realms helps us to guard against premature, crude, and inaccurate interpretations, relating macroscopic effects of the organism to specific, localizable individual events in the realm of atomic physics. The second, and as a possible unintended consequence of the first point, this could take us down the path, he says, of an arbitrary, vitalistic speculation, unless the determinacy of organic life is affirmed and explored further. Now, taking Alsasser's second point, a certain amount of predictability might be found in a consideration of the fluctuations of populations from a statistical point of view, scaling up from the behaviour of individual organisms to that of identified groups of a species. Now, we saw that Charles Darwin acknowledged the futility of constructing a totalising narrative of the procession of evolution based on the fragmented evidence of the fossil record, observing that it would be as rash in us to dogmatise, this is quoting, on the succession of organic beings throughout the world, as it would be for a naturalist to land for 5 minutes on some one barren point in Australia, and then to discuss the number and range of its productions. In the absence of complete and direct evidence of such processes, Levin again, as well as Jorgensen, show how a quantum mechanical trade-off in accuracy of measurement when we move from the level of individual members of a specific population to the broader regularity of the movements of the total population demonstrates the extent to which the design and careful deployment of mathematical modelling has potential benefits. I'm going to point out some of these problems with this. So this is Levin. He says, thus we focus attention on larger spatial regions, longer timescales, or statistical ensembles, for which macroscopic statistical behaviours are more regular. This is the principal technique of scientific inquiry. By changing the scale of description, we move from unpredictable, unrepeatable individual cases to collections of cases whose behaviour is regular enough to allow generalisations to be made. In so doing, we trade off the loss of detail or heterogeneity within a group for the gain of predictability. We thereby extract and abstract those fine-scale features that have relevance for the phenomena observed on other scales. In physics, this trade-off is well studied and goes to the heart of the problem of measurement. At fine scales, quantum mechanical laws must replace classical mechanical laws. Laws become statistical in character, dealing only with probabilities of occupancy. Now I want to take this to an example. So consider Alfred Russel Wallace's comments on natural balance using the example of the now extinct passenger pigeon. Now, he asks how a bird that lays only 1 or 2 eggs a season, typically raising only 1 chick at a time, could become so abundant, especially when we compare it to other birds that produce greater numbers of offspring. The explanation, he continues, must be in the abundance and wide distribution of the pigeon's main food source, whilst the bird itself, he says, is capable of a very rapid and long-continued flight, so that it can pass without fatigue over the whole of the district it inhabits, and as soon as the supply of food begins to fail in one place, is able to discover a fresh feeding ground. Now, conservationists have noted the surprising nature of the decline of this once superabundant species. So its population estimated at 3 to 5 billion in the 19th century. Its final known example dying at Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. Now, the favourable conditions for the maintenance of such large roaming flocks, primarily the abundance of its main food source, as recounted by Wallace, were mitigated by its historical population fluctuations. And that's been discovered through, more recently, through ancient DNA analysis. So normally the species experienced recurring population fluctuations of large magnitude, from which it had been able to recover. However, some dramatic fluctuations under certain conditions, that is a high degree of stochasticity, made the species particularly vulnerable to extinction. So it was hunted profusely. Apologies for that. Okay, so I'm almost to the end of the paper. Now, the interactions between the genetic composition of individuals within a species, deemed, for example, to be not only superabundant, like the passenger pigeon, ironically, but also despotic or invasive, and the ecosystems they occupy are complex. To conclude this chapter, I want to return to the case of the Australian noisy miner. Now, this bird typifies what's described as a strongly interacting or keystone species, or one that has a disproportionate influence on the collection of other species with which it shares its habitat. Now, the influence of this species is deemed to be disproportionate in relation to the relative size of individuals and its numbers. In short, if we take the noisy miner as an example, given its relatively small size, so it's probably about the size of a blackbird, offset by its presence in large numbers and augmented no doubt by its hyper-aggressive behaviour, it exerts considerable pressure on neighbouring species. And it's this combination of keystone status and the tendency to assert that dominance, typically in the defence of resource-rich territories, using aggressive behaviour, that earns a species its despotic status. But there are considerable problems associated with measuring the effects of a despotic species. So bear in mind that noisy miners are a highly visible species, precisely because of their success in subsisting in human-dominated habitats. They are urban adapters. They're notable for dominating patches. This is in the scientific literature. And that's a somewhat euphemistic way of describing patches of forest left undisturbed between expanses of land developed for human agriculture and habitation. So the effects of human activity tend to be excluded from the account of the behaviour of despotic species as an underlying assumption or in historical descriptions of the changes in habitat configuration over time. So in the case of the noisy miner, this change is set within the timescale of European colonisation of Australia. Now, leaving aside this habitual omission, let's call it that for the moment, and returning to the problem of measurement, we can turn to some potential methods for calculating species density. So it's not a straightforward categorization to refer to something as, or to label something as despotic. Now, arguments for the identification of invasive species need to take into account a genetic level awareness, for example, of the founder population. Its speed and strength will depend on the genetic health and diversity of that population. So to illustrate this, one theorist shows how the European rabbit was introduced to Australia using only an initial founding population of 13 individuals. Despite this, the current expanded population shows not degradation in genetic diversity, presumably because of the intentionally rich diversity of the founder population. So what this tells us is that a genetically diverse founder will spread more successfully than a genetically narrow one. Thus, the interaction between evolution and ecology must be studied in relation to the founding population itself, rather than simply its effects on the biodiversity of the indigenous ecosystem. So at what point then can we say the species has become invasive? So just to end with two viewpoints. Now, Charles Elton's book, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants, and that was originally published in 1958, is seen as influential in determining invasive species. Now, Elton presents a summary of evidence of the role of invasive species in disturbing ecological balance, particularly in small or sparse populations, such as those on remote tracts of land and islands that are typically rendered accessible by the fluctuations of migrating human populations. Now, Elton's study refers to early laboratory experiments that indicate the vulnerability of populations with low biodiversity. For example, an island with one predator and one prey species. So their vulnerability to drastic fluctuations in the numbers of each species. Recall also the case of the passenger pigeon, the decline of which seemed ultimately to be a combination of factors that accentuated its fluctuating population levels. It was hunted aggressively also, which would have affected its ability to recover. Now, rather optimistically, Elton argues that more complex mixtures of populations facilitate greater overall stability, since species that might otherwise become too successful are subjected to a broader range of checks on their expansion. He thinks, so it goes on, a greater variety of predator, prey, parasite, disease combinations ensures that overall biodiversity is maintained within a complex system of counterbalances. Now, the noisy miner is characterised as a species with the potential to become an invasive one, given its aggressive behaviour, and more importantly, it seems, its preference for eucalyptus forest patches. So the proliferation of eucalyptus plantations worldwide may, so the literature goes, accidentally lend the bird a route to expansion beyond its indigenous habitats, with severe consequences for any native birds it encounters. Now, Chris Thomas, more recently in his book Inheritors of the Earth, and this was from 2017, argues for a rather different understanding of invasive species, whilst attempting to maintain the conservationist imperative to encourage biodiversity. And in this book, he considers the total biomass on Earth, so the overall metabolic turnover, and not simply those species considered naturally occurring or wild. And he says, we cannot reverse time. Instead, we should appreciate changes that are positive as much as we regret any losses. Yes, we have caused the extinction of the world's largest land mammals, but the American bison is back within the confines of where we allow them to roam. Elephants are doing well in Danum. The grey whale is again migrating in impressive numbers along the western seaboard of North America. Deer and foxes are in our backyards. Nature is fighting back. Perhaps Thomas's position strikes a balance between Lyell's estimation of the impact of human activity on the Earth as merely one, or that of one animal amongst many, and the later imperative to track and promote biodiversity amidst increasing levels of environmental degradation. So the gradual derogation of species status, as in the case of the noisy miner, could be viewed instead as an indication of the capacity of our fellow inhabitants of the Earth to fight back, in spite of Homo sapiens' tendency to punish other species for their resilience. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you.